talk to you a little bit about the occupational health hazards in the rapidly growing cannabis industry. I'll take a little over 30 minutes or so for the formal presentation part, so there'll be plenty of opportunity for Q&A after the presentation. So this first slide just kind of outlines what we're going to talk about. We'll start by sharing some general information on the current state of cannabis legalization and the cannabis industry in particular from a United States perspective. I'll then provide a brief overview of the activities and the processes involved in cannabis cultivation and processing. And in so doing, I'll highlight a variety of workplace exposures and hazards that are faced by cannabis workers. And then finally, I'll present some results from a small study that we undertook at 2 indoor cannabis production and processing facilities here in Washington State, in which we measured airborne concentrations of several potential respiratory hazards. And we also conducted respiratory health measurements on the cannabis workers themselves. Okay, so this slide gives you a snapshot of where we're at in terms of the legal status of cannabis at the moment. The areas in blue, cannabis is legal for both adult use and medical use, and then areas in green, cannabis is legal as authorized by a physician for certain medical applications. So cannabis has long been classified as an illegal drug in many nations, including Canada and the US. However, the legal status around cannabis has been becoming progressively much more permissive. So in 2012, Washington and Colorado became the first states in the US to legalize recreational use of marijuana. California followed in 2016, and north of the border, you folks in Canada followed in 2018. And then just last year, in 2021, the Mexican Supreme Court voted to legalize adult use of cannabis, although some legal inconsistencies still have to be worked out before that ruling will take full effect. So here on the west coast of North America, we're certainly in the heart of the legalization of adult use for cannabis. Things are a bit of a patchwork here in the United States. So at the federal level, cannabis remains illegal. However, there are currently 36 states, 4 permanently inhabited US territories, and the District of Columbia that have passed initiatives that legalize medical or recreational use of cannabis here in the US. So kind of first of several poll questions, there's been a lot of hype around cannabis legalization. How big do you all think that the cannabis industry has become? And this question applies specifically to the US because we have good, well, relatively good employment estimates here in the US. So I'll give you a few moments to fill in the poll and register your estimates. And I think Angela is going to start that poll for us.
Sorry, Pratik, are you online? Could you try launch the poll? Because I think you logged in with the OEH seminar account, and now I can't really launch the poll anymore.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, just do it, Angela. Just doing it.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I think it's there. Great.
Okay, it looks like we've stabilized in terms of the number of respondents there. So first of all, congratulations, about 85% of you responded. That's a higher proportion than those that were willing to get vaccinated for COVID here in the US. But that aside, it looks like the preponderance of the vote was for 200,000 or 300,000 and above in terms of the cannabis workforce in the US. So so here's the answer. So as you can see from the attached graphic, the cannabis industry in the US currently employs over 320,000 workers, and you can see that the trend in terms of the number of workers has been growing rapidly over the past 4 or 5 years. There are now more people employed in the cannabis industry than there are pilots, dentists, or paramedics. And so it's an industry that has a large number of workers employed in various aspects of the industry. In 2020, in the United States, cannabis sales reached $17.5 billion. So that's a lot of money. That was a 50% increase from the previous year, despite the fact that in 2020, we were in an economic downturn caused by the COVID pandemic. Here's some recent data that I was able to find for Canada. And so this chart lists the number of cannabis cultivation businesses. So this is not retail, this is on that cultivation production side. And we can see that British Columbia is second only to Ontario in the number of licensed cannabis producers. So there's around 100 producers in Ontario and around 60 or so in British Columbia. So for reference, south of the border here, Washington and Oregon each have over 1,000 licensed cannabis producers. Now, while the legal cannabis industry is still somewhat in its nascent stages, growing cannabis is nothing new. Of course, widespread illegal cultivation of cannabis has occurred throughout North America over many years. Nevertheless, despite, as a consequence of cannabis cultivation being illegal, very little formal research has been conducted in regards to the hazards faced by cannabis farm workers or cannabis production workers. While some of the exposures that those workers experience may be unique to the production of cannabis, many of the hazards that cannabis workers face are similar to those that would be experienced by other agricultural or horticultural workers. And therefore, as occupational hygienists, we can apply much of what we've learned from those related industries and use it to help protect the health of cannabis workers. So for the next part of the talk, I'm going to step through some of the key processes involved in cannabis production, and we'll consider some of the potential occupational hazards that might be associated with those processes. So to begin, cannabis cultivation typically starts by growing new plants, either from seed or more commonly by propagating those new plants from clippings that are taken from older plants. And those clippings are then placed into a mixture of soil and a rooting hormone. Propagation of the plants from clippings preserves the genetic background of the parent plants, and it helps to ensure a consistent product from crop to crop. Conversely, cross-fertilization of parent plants that have different genetic backgrounds with subsequent growth of plants from seed allows the cannabis farmer to select for specific desired traits. For example, strains that produce high levels of the pharmacologically active tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, strains that have resistance to specific pests, or strains that provide desirable flavor and aroma profiles. Plant breeding and cloning almost always takes place indoors under artificial lights with the plants in small containers. And so potential exposures to workers at this stage would include UV emissions from the artificial lights, ergonomic hazards associated with the repetitive motion of taking these small cuttings and planting them into the small pots, and potentially awkward body positions involved with harvesting or removing the clippings from the parent plant or capturing the seeds from the parent plant. In addition, organic dust, including molds and fungi, may also be present at this stage of the process, and if so, would be a potential hazard for the workers. As the plants grow, they are transferred to larger vessels and moved into different grow rooms, or moved outdoors. So cannabis can be grown indoors, typically in large warehouses, or it can be grown in shade houses and glass houses, or it can be grown outdoors where the plants are actually planted into the ground. The life cycle of the cannabis plant is controlled by the light-dark cycle. So in the natural environment, the shortening of days in the fall pushes the cannabis plant from its vegetative state into its flowering stage. The flower, of course, is what is harvested and sold. Indoor grows can achieve 3 to 4 flowering cycles per year by artificially manipulating that light-dark cycle. In contrast, outdoor grows achieve only a single cycle. However, typically outdoor grown plants are much larger and produce more flower per plant compared to indoor grown plants. So this slide illustrates examples of different grow environments. So top right, for example, we have an example of an indoor grow, and you can see there artificial lights hanging relatively low close to the top of the cannabis canopy. The two slides over on the left are both examples of glass house or greenhouse grows where natural sunlight would penetrate through in this case, it would be plastic coating of some sort. Both in the top example from the roof and from the sides of the building. In the bottom example, it would be coming in just through the roof. And with these greenhouse and glasshouse grows, that natural sunlight is typically complemented with use of artificial lights. And so we see some artificial lights here in the top left, and those metal cans in the bottom left are also artificial lights. And then on bottom right is an example of an outdoor grow. You can maybe see that the plants here are a little bit larger to what we saw for the indoor grows, and these would be planted directly into the ground. So the workers in these facilities undertake challenging physical labor. Some plants have the plants actually lifted up off of the ground on moving tables, as you can see down in the bottom left. And these tables can be moved around to allow the workers access into the spaces between the rows of the plants. And other examples, such as the top left and the top right, or for the outdoor facility, the plants are actually down on the ground or rooted in the earth. And in these scenarios, the workers are going to have to crouch down into uncomfortable positions in order to be able to water the plants or to remove some of the vegetative growth when they're trying to promote growth of the flowering material and so on. Growers in Washington State are regulated based on canopy size, so they're only licensed to have a specific number of square feet of cannabis canopy. And of course, maximizing that canopy means keeping plants squishing as many plants as close together as possible. And you see a great example of that down here in the bottom left. That results in the need for workers to squeeze into small and awkward spaces, like the gap between the rows here. They're squeezing into those spaces with heavy items, and that's going to create ergonomic challenges for the workers. And it also tends to provide a really favorable environment for growth of pathogens such as mold and mildew. So the kinds of exposures that would be experienced at this stage of the process include exposure to UV radiation, either from the grow lamps or from sunlight. The physical hazards associated with lifting the pots, moving the pots around, hunching down to do work on the plants themselves. There could be mold, mildew, pesticides, other organic matter that's going to be present in these environments. And there's also going to be a variety of volatile organic compounds, including terpenes. So terpenes are volatile unsaturated hydrocarbons, and this class of molecules is what gives plants their aroma, including the aroma for things like lavender, pine, eucalyptus, hops, and of course the characteristic aroma of cannabis itself. So these terpenes are naturally occurring, but they are also often used in synthetic products like pine sol or perfume, for example, or air fresheners would be another example. So research on terpenes outside of the context of cannabis has shown that many terpenes can cause allergic, respiratory, and dermal reactions in some people. Conversely, other studies have suggested that terpenes can provide positive health benefits. However, the health consequences of exposure to terpenes within the context of cannabis cultivation and processing is largely unknown. So once the flowers reach the desired size, they are removed from the plants and hung to dry, as shown in the pictures on the left. So this is an example, bottom left here is an example of a drying room. And you can see that the cannabis stems are hung in these rooms to dry. The top image shows plastic buckets where essentially the stems have been taken off the cannabis plants, the leaves have been removed, and you're just left with the stems containing the buds and the flowers. Care needs to be taken to adequately control the environment in these drying rooms, especially the relative humidity and the temperature, in order to prevent mold growth. And again, this work is physically laborious. Potential exposures of concern are listed on the slide there, and they include mold and mildew, and in particular the VOCs and terpenes. So the VOC exposures are very high, especially in those drying rooms. You've got a lot of fresh plant material that is concentrated into a small space. And when the leaves on the plant get cut or damaged during harvest, that promotes release of some of the terpenes. So think about what happens when you take a handful of mint or basil and you crush that up for your cup of mint tea or for making a mojito. There's a release of those aromatic volatiles. And that's exactly what happens when the cannabis plants get harvested and put into these drying rooms. After the initial drying phase, the cannabis is then transferred to enclosed plastic bags or tubs, such as those shown in the top right of the figure. And the plant is allowed to sit inside those plastic bags or tubs and allowed to cure. And this also can be an ideal environment for growth of mold. Finally, the dried and cured flowers are sorted and graded. The highest quality bud is hand trimmed to remove the leaves and stems. And that involves repetitive motion and potentially repetitive motion injuries for the workers. It also involves poor posture because they typically hunched over a table as they're doing this fine detailed work of trimming each bud manually by hand. The lower quality flower is mechanically trimmed and then crushed to create a coarse powder. And you can see a tray with the coarse powder at the top right here. And then that coarse powder can be loaded into the hand rolled joints. And that's what we're seeing an example of in the top right. And you can see that there's a lot of exposure to the dust, the cannabis dust in this particular process. And if there happened to be mold that had been growing on the cannabis plant when it was harvested, there's going to be exposure of the workers to mold and mold spores during this process as well. The coarse powder can also be extracted using solvents to create concentrates that are high in the THC and other cannabinoids. And then those concentrates can be sold as waxes or oils, or they can be used to infuse edibles. So the workers that are engaged in preparation of the concentrates may be exposed to solvents that are used to extract the cannabinoids. And typically that's going to be supercritical CO2 or a mixture of butane and propane. Okay, so rolling on to our next poll question. Now that you know a little bit about the processes in the industry and what it looks like, please go ahead and register your vote in this poll as to which of the listed injuries or illnesses you think might be most prevalent in this industry. Okay, I think we can go ahead and close the poll at this point. So there is a large preponderance of votes for the overexertion and repetitive motion industry injuries, with the remaining 25% in the respiratory exposure category. So let's see what the data shows us. So the graphic here was prepared from the Workmen's Compensation System in Washington State. And so this represents claims from injured cannabis workers that were registered in the Washington State Workmen's Compensation System. And what we see here is that, in fact, most of the claims are associated with trauma due to struck by or caught an object. And this likely reflects the large amount of new construction that's going on as this new industry continues to grow rapidly. So there's lots of remodeling of warehouses to make indoor grows, lots of physical infrastructure being installed for outdoor grows and shade house grows and so on. And those construction related activities are probably the major source for these acute trauma injuries. We do see that the second category is the overexertion and repetitive motion injuries. And we see also a significant number of claims associated with exposure to harmful substances. And if we kind of look at the detail for that, we see that harmful substances includes inhalation injuries associated with exposure to pesticides, allergens, dust and mold, and other respiratory hazards. Okay, so that completes the overview of the work activities and potential exposures in cannabis production. And so for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to focus specifically on inhalation exposure and potential respiratory effects on the cannabis workers. So we chose to focus on that particular topic because in our initial interviews with cannabis workers and employers, those workers identified respiratory health as an important health concern. Simultaneously, there had been several cases of allergic airway disease associated with occupational exposure to cannabis that have been reported. I think in Washington State, that number is now something like 10 cases of respiratory disease associated with cannabis production. And that led our State Department of Labor and Industries to post the hazard alert that's showing on the slide here, highlighting this potential risk for occupational asthma in cannabis workers. So we set out to do a small study of respiratory exposures and respiratory health. And the study took place at 2 cannabis producer processors in Washington State who grow cannabis indoors. So the first facility, workplace number 1, that is a tier 3 grow that uses conventional non-organic cultivation methods. So tier 3 is the largest size of producer allowed in Washington State, and it is licensed to grow up to 30,000 square feet of plant canopy. This particular facility, in addition to growing their own cannabis indoors, they seasonally purchase outdoor grown cannabis from other growers in Washington State, which they then bring to their indoor facility here in Seattle, and they process that into consumer products. And this facility had 45 workers, 31 of whom participated in the study. In contrast, Workplace 2 was a smaller facility. So it is a tier 2 indoor grow that uses organic pesticide-free cultivation methods. They only process their own product, so they don't bring in any product from other growers to process. A tier 2 facility, that's the intermediate size category of grow in Washington State. And they are licensed to grow up to 10,000 square feet of plant canopy, so about a third less than the tier 3 facilities. And this particular facility, like I say, it used organic pesticide-free methods of cultivation. And they had 20 workers in their facility, 11 of whom participated in the study. So the exposure assessment for this study involved taking full shift area samples at 4 task zones within each facility. You see the 4 task zones listed at the top of the slide here. We selected these because a priori we hypothesized that the level of airborne contaminants and the mixture of contaminants present would differ between the 4 task zones. And so one might imagine that the terpenes would be higher in the grow rooms where you've got a lot of green plant material, and then maybe the organic dust would be higher in areas like the trim area and the pre-roll where you're dealing with dry cannabis products. The office area at each facility was separate from the other task zones, and this was selected as a reference location and was anticipated to have contaminant levels that were representative of the ambient background. At facility number 1, the full shift sampling occurred on Mondays and Fridays for a total of 8 work days, whereas for facility number 2, we only undertook a single day of sampling. And the measurements that we collected were measurements of particle mass concentration. We actually used a Dialos direct reading particle counter for our measurements of particle mass, and so that allows us to get particle number concentration, provides information on size distribution of the particles, and then we were able to convert those values to particle mass concentration. We also used sorbent tubes to collect the terpenes, and we analyzed the sorbent tubes for 21 individual cannabis-associated terpenes using gas chromatography with mass spectrometry. So let's take a look at the exposure results. So this slide represents the particle mass concentrations aggregated by task zone. It turned out that the particle concentrations were broadly similar at both facilities, and so we've aggregated the data from the 2 facilities together in this particular plot. So this is an example of a box plot. I'll just take a moment to explain how to read these. So along the bottom, we see our 4 different task zones. Focusing here on the trim facility, these boxes represent the distribution of the measurements at the trim location. The dark line in the center of the box, that represents the median concentration. And then the upper and lower bounds of the box itself represent so the lower is the 25th percentile of the data, and the upper bound here is the 75th percentile of the data. So what we found was that the mean, arithmetic mean particulate mass concentrations were highest in the trim area, intermediate in the pre-roll and the grow task areas, and the arithmetic mean was actually lowest for the referent office area. So the mean was around 60 micrograms per cubic meter for the trim area and around 27 or so for the office area. The particulate mass concentrations in the trim and the pre-roll task areas were statistically significantly elevated compared to the referent office area. Okay, so what does that mean as an occupational hygienist? Well, first of all, none of the samples that we collected in the study resulted in PM concentrations that exceed the relevant permissible exposure limits here in the US. So our PEL for time-weighted 8-hour exposure for particles that are not otherwise regulated. So for general particulate mass, that permissible exposure limit is 15 milligrams per cubic meter, or 15,000 micrograms per cubic meter on the scale. And so none of the particle mass exposures got anywhere close to being a violation of that permissible exposure limit. Moving on to the data for the terpene mass concentrations. So somewhat similar to the previous slide, we see that the concentrations are highest at the trim area, and again, lowest at the office location. And the concentrations in the pre-roll and the grow locations were intermediate between those extremes. Currently, so we don't actually have a permissible exposure limit for terpenes here in the US, and to my knowledge, I don't believe that you do in Canada either. The only occupational standards I'm aware of for terpenes are from the European Union, and their 8-hour time-weighted standard for terpenes ranges between 20 to 100 parts per million by volume, depending on the specific terpene. And that equates to around 50 to 200 milligrams per cubic meter, again, depending on the specific terpene that you're talking about. So our measurements were all typically below 50 milligrams per cubic meter, which is the lower end of that EU standard. However, there were 4 samples that were greater than 50 milligrams per cubic meter, and 2 samples way up the top here in the trim area that were above 100 milligrams per cubic meter. Although terpenes and particle mass were both highest in the trim area compared to the other task zones, overall particle mass and terpenes were only weakly correlated with each other. And then when we broke things down by task zone, the associations between particle mass and terpene mass were very weak and were not statistically significant. So it seems like there are some difference in terms of the composition in various parts of the facility, and we can't necessarily rely on particulate mass as being a surrogate for VOCs or vice versa. Okay, so I'll next describe the health data. I see the time's moving on, so I better speed up a little bit here. The health data was collected on the workers at 2 facilities. We focused primarily on facility 1, where we conducted a repeated measures design, and only did 1 day of health measurements at facility number 2 in order to evaluate the generalizability of the observations from facility number 1. So at facility number 1, we administered a baseline questionnaire to the workers regarding their work activities and their health symptoms. And then those workers that reported that they had health or work-related respiratory symptoms, we then enrolled them in the repeated measures cohort study. And for that subset of 10 symptomatic workers, we did daily symptom questionnaires and work activity questionnaires for 4 shifts. We also measured pre and post shift spirometry to measure their lung function, pre and post shift exhaled nitric oxide, which is a marker of airway inflammation. And we did skin prick testing for a variety of allergens, several molds, and for a couple of varieties of cannabis. So I'll just skip over this slide in the interest of time. We defined abnormal response to their health measures as based on American Thoracic Society criteria, as shown on the top of the slide. For the skin prick test, where that's basically a measure of the size of skin irritation or erythema that occurs when the skin is pricked with the challenge allergen. As I say, we challenged with 4 types of mold extract, 2 types of extracts from 2 strains of cannabis, and then we had saline as a negative control for that assay, and histamine as the positive control for the assay. Okay, so moving on to the health results. So this slide illustrates the participant characteristics. And typical of Western Washington, most of the participants are Caucasian. I want to draw your attention to their responses regarding smoking status. So we had a relatively high prevalence of tobacco smoking, and you'll see we had an extremely high prevalence of smoking of cannabis amongst these workers. And then if we drill down into that cannabis data a little bit more, the workers used cannabis frequently. So 80% of the workers smoked cannabis multiple times per day. Smoking was the predominant way that the workers used cannabis, but many of them also use cannabis in edibles and other forms of using it as well. So that's a caveat to bear in mind as we talk about the respiratory data, given the really high prevalence of cannabis use, and particularly smoking of cannabis amongst these study participants. Okay, so based on responses to the symptom questionnaire, work-related respiratory symptoms were the most common. The data here is in green is for facility number 1 and black is for facility number 2. And you can see that greater than 65% of workers across the 2 facilities reported work-related respiratory symptoms. Dermal symptoms were reported least frequently, but close to 20% or so of the workers also reported dermal symptoms. So a priori, we had hypothesized that we might see acute reversible changes in lung function and airway inflammation in response to cannabis exposures at work. And so therefore, at facility number 1, we evaluated the cross-shift and cross-week changes in these health measurements. And what we would expect to see would be increases in exhaled nitric oxide, so that's increased lung inflammation, and decreases in FEV1 and FVC, indicating poorer lung function. So we did see a modest increase cross-week in the exhaled nitric oxide, which was what we expected, but we did not see that same increase across the work shift. And then for FEV1 and FVC, we did see small decreases in these measurements of lung function, both cross-shift and cross-week. But those changes were very modest and were not statistically significant. So overall, we did not see strong evidence of short-term changes in lung function and airway inflammation that were associated with cannabis exposure. In general, what we found was that the abnormalities in airway inflammation or lung function were persistent, meaning that if a worker had elevated airway inflammation at one time point, it was elevated across all of their time points. So this slide summarizes the overall health outcomes for the 10 workers at each of the 2 facilities. And overall, we can see that facility 1 on the left had a higher prevalence of impaired respiratory health and cannabis sensitization. So the purple boxes represent abnormal health measures for either the airway inflammation, the lung function, or the cannabis sensitization. So for facility number 1, 5 of the 10 participants had abnormal or borderline exhaled nitric oxide, indicating elevated airway inflammation. For facility number 2, it was only 3 of 10 participants. For the lung function, 7 out of 10 of the participants at facility number 1 had abnormal lung function. That was only 2 participants for facility number 2. And then again, for facility number 1, half of them, 50%, exhibited an allergic sensitization to one or other of the 2 cannabis test strains in the skin prick assay. For facility number 2, only 2 of the 10 participants illustrated cannabis sensitization in the skin prick test. And for reference, 0 of 5 University of Washington research scientists exhibited allergic sensitization to cannabis. So this slide summarizes the takeaways from the small pilot study. So we did see a high prevalence of work-related allergic symptoms, especially respiratory, in the cannabis workers. This is the first study, to our knowledge, that looked at the immunologically mediated response to cannabis, specifically amongst cannabis farm workers. And we did see a relatively high prevalence of cannabis sensitization, airway inflammation, and impaired lung function among employees with work-related symptoms. The conclusions, of course, are limited by the small sample size and by potential confounding from the ubiquitous recreational use of cannabis amongst the employees. So just as a coda to that last point, we did conduct a subsequent pilot study where we enrolled study participants in a controlled population, 20 cannabis users who were not occupationally exposed to cannabis. And we found that the cannabis workers had 35% higher exhaled nitric oxide and 8% lower lung function compared to the non-occupationally exposed cannabis users. And so that is perhaps another piece of evidence indicating that the cannabis exposure at work is important over and above the personal use of cannabis in terms of these respiratory health effects. So that leads to our final poll question. So in view of the high prevalence of the respiratory symptoms that we saw in that pilot study, what of the exposures listed on the slide do you think is the most likely cause of the respiratory symptoms in the cannabis workers? And Pratik, if you could go ahead and load up that final poll. Okay, so we're up to about 80% participation there, and it looks like almost half of you figured that organic dust, which could include pollen, mold, and mildew, would be the primary exposure of concern. But there were certainly votes for all of the other potential exposures in that category. So in truth, we really don't know which of the exposures that was listed on that slide is responsible for the respiratory health effects that we observed. Could be any one of those exposures listed. It could be other exposures that were not listed. So for example, dust mites that are often used as a biological control for pathogens in these facilities. Or it could be that the trigger is different for different workers. So this is an area where additional research is needed to identify the specific causes of respiratory disease in the cannabis workers, to identify the biological mechanisms by which these exposures do cause respiratory illness, and importantly, to intervene to control the critical exposures in order to improve the health of the cannabis workers. So if you're interested in finding out more about this topic, two references that I can point you to. So there was a recent special issue of the Annals of Work Exposures and Health that was devoted to occupational health in the cannabis industry. So that provides a good current perspective on the state of the science. The URL is listed here. And then kind of on a more practical side, there's a best practices guide that was produced by the Colorado Department of Public Health and the Environment. And the URL for that slide, for that resource is listed there. So in closing, I want to acknowledge all of my collaborators on this project. And in particular, I want to thank Lara Kaminsky and Caitlin Ryan from the Cannabis Alliance. So the Cannabis Alliance is a cannabis business association here in Washington State. And they were absolutely instrumental in being trusted brokers that allowed to make a connection between us university researchers and the growers themselves. And that was what allowed us to be able to get into these cannabis farms and to measure exposures and health outcomes on the workers. So with that, I'm going to stop the screen share